Hello everyone, my name is Michael McCann, and while I know that there are hundreds of tutorials online about texturing in Blender, I wanted to quickly discuss some techniques that aren't commonly demonstrated. I'll start with an ordinary texture, and without adding a lot of geometry or modifiers, be giving it the illusion of displacement, and then creating this exposed brick effect. Then I'll do the same thing with a street texture, but after adding the displacement, I'll use a specularity map to give the illusion of puddles. I'll be using this small cottage to demonstrate the exposed brick, but before I do that, I want to give it the illusion that it's maybe old, unattended, or like abandoned, so I want some like moss around the base of it. And that's really easy to do. You can see right now I have just a basic material setup. It's just the texture coordinates, the mapping into the image texture, and diffuse material. So I'll hit Shift A and then add, mix RGB, and I'll just try to select some colors I associate with moss, like maybe a greenish yellow, and maybe make the second one a brown color. And so now I'll just mix the texture with that mix RGB node. And now all those colors are mixed, together, so we want to separate it. And so we can do that with a gradient texture. Plug that into the factor, and you can see that that's working, but it's kind of the wrong way, so we have to just rotate it around. So we'll need to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And we'll want to rotate this on Y. It's the wrong way, so we'll go negative 90 degrees. And we'll have to move it up a little too. Okay, I think that looks pretty good, but the color itself looks a little flat, so we'll have to set this from mix to multiply, and then it kind of blends in with that plaster texture. Now that that's done, I can start working on the exposed brick texture. So I'll just Shift D to duplicate that diffuse material. And actually, before we do that, I'll just show you, I've already set up my materials and UV unwrapped everything. So you can see here I have those walls. I'm going to export that UV layout to the desktop. And now I'm going to open GIMP. So I use the UV map as a reference, and we're basically just going to draw on where we want our exposed brick to be. So I'll add a layer. And then I want to select sort of a jagged brush, nothing too smooth. And I'm just going to paint along. Maybe I'll have it sort of wrap around the corner there. So it'll go from the side and then up to the front where the windows are. And I just want to do this kind of randomly, but I don't want to go overboard. I don't want to have too much. It's just going to be in certain areas. Typically around the windows and the doors look pretty good, and along the base. Looks good, and maybe a little spot here. Okay, I think that's looking all right. I'm not going to bother putting any on the back, I don't think. I think I'll just be rendering it from this side. So now I'm going to hide that UV layer and create another layer. And we need to make this all white, so I'm going to use the fill tool and just fill the whole layer and then drop it down underneath so the black is on top. And now I'll go ahead and export that to my desktop. Now I'll just add that texture to the node editor. And plug it into the displacement on the material output. And you can see immediately, you can see the effect that it has. And there is a way that you can control the strength of it, and you can do that just by adding a math node. So you can go Shift A, Converter, Math, and you need to set it to multiply. And then you can use this bottom value slider to adjust the strength of it. But I'll wait till after I add the brick texture in to make those adjustments. So now I can apply a brick texture to that second diffuse material. And then I can mix the two diffuse materials together with a mix shader. So now I'll select that texture that I made in GIMP, and I'll Shift D to duplicate it. And that'll be the factor of our mix shader. But they're the wrong way, so we'll just have to switch those materials. Okay, and that's more of what I wanted, but the brick looks a little big. So just on the mapping node, I'm going to scale it. Okay, and that looks a lot better. And because this displacement is plugged into the material output, we can still use normal maps for the brick and plug that into the diffuse shader. I'll Shift D to duplicate this texture node. Now I'll just open up that normal map for that brick texture. And make sure to add a normal map node. And then plug that into the diffuse shader. And now I'm going to add a glossy shader and mix it with the diffuse. And it's important also to connect that normal map into the glossy shader. So now it looks okay, but the brick is way too glossy, so we can control that with a specularity map. plug that into the factor of the mix shader, and it still looks a little too glossy. So the way I fix that is I add a math node, go to converter, and then add math. And if you think of it this way, if you want less specularity, you would want to change this from add to subtract, but it also works if you just keep it at add and go in a negative value. So I can take this down, and that looks a little better. Now I can adjust the depth of that displacement. That looks pretty good. I also want to add in that same gradient effect so that the brick looks like it's been affected by that moss, as well as the plaster. It all just blends a little more nicely. Now I'm just going to tweak the roughness of the glossy shader so that the brick looks a little more realistic. And I'm pretty happy with that. So now I'm going to move on to that street texture. And I'm just going to set it up the exact same way that I did the brick texture. The importance of using this technique, it's really good for scenes that have, maybe you have a scene that has a lot of geometry, or maybe a really big particle system. Maybe you're doing like a grassy field and you want like a path running through it that has puddles. Well, that can be really hard on your computer, not only for render times, but it can be frustrating just in the viewport when everything is frozen and it's not really moving very well. You know, it doesn't really make for a very fun experience in Blender to have to wait for your screen to catch up with everything that you're trying to do. So if this effect, maybe if it's not really the focal point of your scene, but you still want that kind of effect of exposed brick or puddles, then it can actually really save your computer a lot of work. So it can be useful for sure. And after I do this, I'll actually show you how to bake it all out so that it can be used in the game engine, and it'll still have that reflective puddle effect. So okay, so this is all set up. There is something about the normal map. I'm going to leave it at the value of 1, which is the default value, just to show you something that's sort of necessary in order to make this work. And I'm going to just do the same thing in GIMP. I'm just going to sort of make a jagged, like maybe this is like the center of the street where it's kind of worn and cracked, and perhaps after it rains, this is where all the water sort of runs into and collects. Maybe make like a few small potholes as well. And now I'll do this the same way, add another layer and fill it with white. And make sure that the black is on top. And export this out. Now again, I'll just add that to the displacement on the material output. And this was the importance of the normal map. You can't see the displacement now because the strength on your normal map for that stone or that cobblestone texture is set too high. So if you take this value down, then you can start to see it. Really 1 is too high anyway. I don't even know why the default is set that high. Usually like a 0.2 I think is maybe a little more realistic in most cases. So anyway, if you plug that displacement into the material output and you can't see the effect, it's because the normal map for your texture is set too high. So now I'm going to duplicate that glossy shader, and this is going to help us fill that displacement with with the effect of water. So I'll use the texture that we made in GIMP, and that'll be our mix factor, but we need to switch it around so we can add a converter color ramp and then just switch the black and white values. And that's working, but the water looks a little too deep, like it's like a lake or something, and you don't really want it to look that deep. You want to be able to see the cobblestone underneath of it, so you can just plug the color into the glossy shader. And that looks okay, but I'm also going to add a color RGB curves. Make sure I'm plugging it into the right one. This is the one that's going into the glossy shader. And I'm just going to darken it up a little bit because wet stone is darker than dry stone, so it just helps with the effect. And for the cobblestone, I'm going to raise the roughness so that it looks a little more dry. And for the glossy shader that's creating that water effect, I'm going to lower it so it's a little more glossy. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. And now I'll bake these textures out so they can be used in the game engine. So now I'm going to create a new image texture. I'll call this street normal. I'm going to bake out two textures. I'm going to bake the normal map first and then just the textures. So I need to add an image texture node. And make sure that that texture is selected, street normal. And then go down to bake and just bake the normal map. Okay, that looks all right. So now I'll just save this somewhere to my desktop. And now I'll create another image. This one will just be called street texture. And again, make sure that this image texture is highlighted with that texture applied to it. And I'm actually going to bake all the dynamics on this one, so I don't want the glossiness of that displacement there. So I'm going to get rid of it by just plugging that first mix shader into the material output. And now I'll bake the combined material so that you get all that light and the shadows and everything all together. Now I'm going to go into GIMP and I'm going to take that texture that we made before and we're going to use this as a specularity map. So I'm just going to invert the colors. Now export this to my desktop. And now I could go into the game engine. Give it a new material and then apply that street texture. Next we'll add that normal map. And then lastly, we'll add that specularity map. And you need to deselect color and check intensity and color underneath of specular. And there you have it. You have a cool sort of reflective puddle for the game engine. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that hopefully you'll find it useful. And please like and subscribe. I haven't really met my subscription goal yet. I'm going for like 40 million. I think that's totally realistic. So again, I'll see you next time. Bye.